In periods of prolonged stability, interpretive systems tend to recede from conscious attention. Their presence is not denied, but it is no longer actively negotiated. Meaning functions automatically. Participation does not require deliberation. Individuals move through roles, institutions, and expectations without needing to name the framework that organizes them. Coherence is experienced as atmosphere rather than structure. Historically, this condition has been mistaken for agreement. In reality, it is closer to habituation. Interpretations that persist long enough cease to announce themselves. They become infrastructural, embedded in language, procedure, and routine. Their authority does not depend on persuasion, but on repetition and environmental reinforcement. Under such conditions, belief is rarely examined because examination is unnecessary for functioning. Awareness tends to enter these systems indirectly. It does not arrive as revelation nor as a challenge. It appears through minor disruptions, comparative exposure, institutional change, historical reflection, or shifts in scale that make implicit assumptions more visible. What was once absorbed unconsciously becomes faintly observable. The framework itself remains intact, but its operations begin to register. This visibility does not immediately alter behavior. Most systems continue to function after they are noticed. However, the experience of participation changes. Actions that once felt neutral begin to feel deliberate. Alignment becomes something that must be maintained rather than assumed. The system is no longer simply inhabited, it is perceived. Cultural and psychological records show that this transition often produces neither rejection nor reform. Instead, it introduces friction. Awareness adds a layer of cognitive distance between the individual and the interpretive structure. That distance is not yet opposition, but it is no longer seamless integration. The framework still organizes meaning, but it does so under observation. In institutional contexts, this has been documented during periods of bureaucratic expansion, ideological saturation, or prolonged consensus. Procedures remain, but confidence in their self-evidence weakens. Language continues to circulate, but its stabilizing effect diminishes. Participation persists, though with increased effort. What changes is not the system's existence, but the conditions under which coherence is sustained. This is the threshold at which resistance begins to emerge, not as action, but as hesitation, not as dissent, but as increased cognitive load. Awareness, once present, alters the texture of engagement. The system still holds, but it does so less quietly. The interpretive framework that stabilizes participation under these conditions is often structured around coherence rather than conviction. It does not require belief in the strong sense. It requires only that meaning remain usable. Language functions. Roles align. Actions are experienced as sufficiently justified to proceed without interruption. The framework's success is measured less by internal agreement than by its capacity to minimize friction. Within such systems, interpretation operates quietly. It explains without drawing attention to itself. Its authority is derived from continuity, how long it has been present, how widely it is shared, how rarely it needs to defend its premises. Over time, this produces a form of legitimacy that is procedural rather than persuasive. Meaning is accepted not because it is compelling, but because it is already there. This framework typically presents itself as neutral. It positions its assumptions as descriptive rather than normative, structural rather than ideological. In doing so, it avoids scrutiny. Examination appears unnecessary, even inappropriate. To question the framework feels less like disagreement and more like disruption. The interpretation becomes synonymous with normal operation. When awareness increases, this neutrality becomes harder to maintain. The interpretive structure does not collapse, but it becomes legible. Its boundaries, once diffuse, begin to sharpen. The distinction between what the system describes and what it prescribes becomes more apparent. What had felt like natural order is recognized as an arrangement, one among other possible arrangements. At this stage, the framework often responds by reinforcing coherence rather than revising meaning. It emphasizes consistency, stability, and continuity. Language grows more procedural. References to history, precedent, or necessity increase. The goal is not to persuade anew, but to preserve usability. Interpretation shifts from guiding understanding to managing visibility. This response is not defensive in an overt sense. It does not announce itself as resistance to change. Instead, it works to absorb awareness without altering function. The framework allows itself to be seen, but only partially. It acknowledges complexity while maintaining operational simplicity. In doing so, it seeks to remain inhabitable even under observation. However, this adjustment subtly alters the relationship between the individual and the system. Meaning is no longer simply received, it is monitored. Participation requires a degree of self-awareness that was previously unnecessary. The framework continues to organize behavior, but its authority is now conditional. It depends on sustained effort to reconcile visibility with coherence. This is the interpretation that governs the emergence of resistance, not a rejection of meaning, but an attempt to hold it together once it can no longer disappear into the background. As awareness becomes a persistent condition rather than a passing disturbance, the interpretive framework begins to incur costs that are not immediately visible. These costs do not appear as failures or breakdowns. They emerge as shifts in how coherence is experienced and maintained. What was once effortless becomes managed. What was once ambient becomes deliberate. One consequence is the erosion of interpretive shelter. Frameworks that function implicitly provide a form of psychological insulation. They allow individuals to act without repeatedly confronting the constructed nature of meaning. Once awareness is sustained, that insulation thins. Participation now occurs alongside recognition. Actions come to require an internal accounting of why they still make sense. Meaning remains available, but it is no longer protective. Another consequence appears in identity formation. When interpretive systems operate invisibly, identity stabilizes through alignment rather than reflection. Roles are inhabited without requiring justification. Under awareness, identity becomes provisional. Alignment must be reaffirmed, sometimes silently, sometimes repeatedly. This does not necessarily produce crisis, but it introduces instability. Identity holds, but it does so with greater effort and less certainty. Agency is also affected, though not in the direction typically assumed. Increased awareness does not reliably expand choice. Instead, it often constrains it. When meanings are held consciously, action becomes heavier. Decisions that once flowed through established channels now require negotiation with the framework itself. Agency is exercised under observation, which alters its texture. The freedom to act is accompanied by the burden of interpretation. At the level of meaning, coherence narrows. Interpretive frameworks under awareness tend to lose flexibility. Because their operations are now visible, deviations feel more consequential. Ambiguity becomes harder to tolerate. The system compensates by tightening language and clarifying boundaries. This preserves function, but at the expense of adaptability. Meaning remains stable, but less elastic. These consequences accumulate without announcement. There is no moment at which the cost is declared. Instead, the experience of participation subtly shifts. Fatigue increases. Hesitation becomes more common. The system continues to organize behavior, but the ease that once characterized engagement diminishes. Coherence persists, but it is no longer self-sustaining. This is the quiet terrain in which resistance takes shape, not as opposition, but as reduced efficiency of alignment. Awareness does not dismantle the framework. It changes what it demands. Interpretive frameworks that adapt to awareness often do so within the conditions that produce them. Their adjustments are local, shaped by specific institutional histories, cultural norms, and scales of operation. Within those boundaries, coherence can still be maintained. Outside them, the same adaptations begin to fail. The difficulty lies in transfer. Frameworks that once functioned implicitly rely on shared background assumptions. When awareness emerges, those assumptions are no longer uniformly available. The framework responds by becoming more explicit, its language hardening, its boundaries sharpening, its acceptable interpretations narrowing. This may preserve internal consistency, but it reduces portability. What works within the originating context does not translate cleanly elsewhere. Across time, this becomes more pronounced. Later audiences encounter the framework without the environmental conditions that once supported it. The original stability is absent. Awareness is present from the outset. The interpretive structure is encountered as an object rather than an atmosphere. Its coherence depends on historical familiarity that no longer exists. Across cultures, a similar misalignment appears. Interpretations designed to remain usable under awareness assume particular relationships between authority, language, and participation. When those assumptions are not shared, the framework's adjustments lose effectiveness. Increased clarity does not resolve confusion. Procedural consistency does not generate legitimacy. What once absorbed awareness now amplifies distance. The framework does not collapse in these conditions. It continues to operate, but its costs become more visible. Participation requires disproportionate effort. Coherence must be enforced rather than inhabited. The system remains intact, yet its stabilizing function weakens. Resistance in these contexts is not a reaction against meaning, but an inability to fully enter it. This is the failure of transfer, not an error that can be corrected, but a limitation that becomes apparent only when conditions change. Awareness did not undermine the framework directly. It altered the circumstances under which the framework could travel. What remains is a structure that still explains, still organizes, still persists, but no longer does so quietly. The cost is not rejection. It is diminished coherence under conditions it was never designed to survive. What awareness ultimately alters is not belief, but silence. Interpretive frameworks that once operated without comment depended on a kind of background quiet. Meaning did not need to be affirmed because it was rarely noticed. Once awareness becomes durable, that quiet is interrupted. The framework is still present, still usable, still authoritative, but it is no longer ambient. It must coexist with its own visibility. Resistance in this sense does not arrive as refusal. It appears as drag, as increased effort required to sustain coherence, as a reduction in how easily meaning settles into place. The system continues to function, but it does so under observation, and observation changes the terms of participation. There is no corrective mechanism that restores the earlier condition. Awareness cannot be undone without force or denial, and neither reliably reestablishes coherence. The framework adapts as far as it can, formalizing itself, narrowing itself, reinforcing continuity. These measures preserve structure, but they do not recover quiet. What remains unresolved is whether such systems are meant to survive awareness at all, or whether their stability was always contingent on remaining partially unseen. The record suggests that awareness does not destroy meaning. It changes the cost of holding it. The framework endures. Resistance persists. And coherence, once effortless, becomes something that must be maintained in full view of its own construction. The file remains open.